A young man leaves his residence in Pembroke Pines, Florida. He tells his roommate he's going to buy some beer and cigarettes. He is never seen again.
We had no car, we had no body, there was zero leads as to what had happened to him.
15 years later, a chance happening reignites the case when the file lands on the desk of a newly appointed detective.
How in the world am I ever going to jumpstart this investigation? Where do I begin?
Her work uncovers a web of lies and deceit and a dark secret. Those who knew were afraid to tell.
Now you have two people who don't know each other, who've never met each other, who are saying the exact same thing.
But when forensics cracks the case right open, those involved have nowhere to hide.
I placed the call to Dr. Melton, and she says, well, I sure hope you're sitting down.
This is the story of that case, and how the perseverance of one police investigator concluded an investigation that no one thought would ever be solved. "24-year-old David Jackson went missing from his home in the quiet Florida suburb of Pembroke Pines in 1988. He left his apartment one June day and simply disappeared. What followed would be an extraordinarily complicated investigation, one which would take 2 decades to come to a conclusion. David was the firstborn child in the Jackson family.
David was born on September 24th of 1963. He was just a great kid, loved music, loved animals. He did not let things bother him. David always wanted to work because he wanted things. 18, he was like a manager at a Solomon's department store, and then at 19, he was a manager at Burger King. And he's just been a very ambitious kid that wanted to do things on his own.
In the early 1980s, when David was working as a manager at Burger King, he met Barbara Britton. He was just out of school and she was a high school senior. The two started a relationship.
You could tell they loved each other, always holding hands, always right next to each other. And they had come to me and said that they wanted to get married, but they were going to wait till after Barbara graduated from high school. And then they found out she was pregnant. So they came to me again and asked what they should do. And I said, that's up to what you two want. Are you two in love? They said yes. And they decided on a big wedding that April. But Barbara did have a temper, and she would get upset very easily over things and would throw things and yell and scream. Things had to be Barbara's way. They had a big wedding at a church, had a big reception. They danced all night, and then Barbara got upset with David as usual and went home to her parents' house. She had Johnny in August, but she stayed at her parents' house the whole time. Barbara was quite under the demands of her father. David did go over there and live for a couple months and paid room and food and board. And then Barbara, I believe, because of her father, who was very strict, would not see David anymore.
Apparently, Barbara's father was not very fond of David. The marriage was short-lived. They were divorced after 2 years.
David was supposed to see Johnny every other weekend, but Barbara always had an excuse. Either Johnny was sick, or Johnny went to a birthday party, or he was out with his grandparents. There was always something. So David maybe got to see Johnny once a month. He wanted to see Johnny all the time. He loved that baby.
The situation worsened when Barbara met a new man, a man called Michael Wolf.
Michael Wolf was 20 years her senior, and they met at a job site at Toys R Us in Hollywood, Florida. So they were co-workers, and I guess they struck up a friendship. Next thing you know, they're together as a couple, They're getting married. They're moving out to Arizona. They're taking Johnny.
David went to pick up Johnny on a Saturday. I think it was June 27th, maybe, 23rd. And David came down to the beach where we were at, and he told me that Barbara had gotten married and she was going to leave that afternoon for Arizona, and he'd have Johnny back in 2 hours instead of his usual 6 to 8 hours with John.
Apparently, it was not in the divorce papers that she couldn't leave the Tri-County or anything. So David was trying to fight for custody of his son.
David stayed in touch by calling. Sometimes she would let him talk to John, most of the time not. He was devastated. All he did was cry.
Over the next few months, David did everything he could to get to see Johnny in Arizona. Eventually, Barbara agreed to a visit, and in November 1987, David and his best friend, Alvaro Bracho, spent a weekend with Johnny in Arizona.
David took him to a cowboy city, and they had pictures of them with the cowboys and the old buildings and everything, and it looked like they were having a great time.
David returned home after his weekend with Johnny and continued to fight for more formal visitation rights.
David had actually gone in front of a judge to get visitation rights, and he was awarded the summer, the 1 month during the summer, to see his son Johnny, where Barbara was not to have any contact during that time.
David moved into a new apartment and began preparing things for his month with Johnny.
He got new furniture that was delivered. He had a truck at the time, and he loved that truck. He saved money and everything to get that truck. But he said that wasn't appropriate for a child, so he bought a car. He just had everything spotless. We went over and saw the house, and he was just gleaming and so excited that John was going to be there. Then Barbara started calling him more and saying that she was being abused and she wanted to come back to David. Barbara and him started having conversations regularly, and this is at the time that she knew that he had gotten visitation rights. And he called me on a Wednesday night about 9:30 and said that Barbara and Johnny had come in July 7th of 1988, and that Barbara was going to stay with him, and that if they got back together, they'd go out and get her furniture.
David, now working as a truck driver for Coca-Cola, was looking forward to spending time with Johnny and was hopeful that he and Barbara might work things out. But on the 25th of June, David abruptly left his apartment.
June 25th of 88, he went to work at Coca-Cola. He helped some buddies move some things, and he was supposed to come by our home because we had some mail for him to pick up. That night, he was supposed to have dinner with two girls, some friends of his. They were going to fix dinner for him, and he never made it there. And I just assumed maybe he was just with a girl all night or something. I could not understand because that's not David.
But the following day, there was still no sign of David.
My other son was in New York with his now wife for the weekend, and he was coming back Sunday the 26th, and David was going to pick them up at the airport. But David never showed up at the airport, which was very unusual. I called Al and said, have you heard from David? He said, no. And I said, well, as soon as he gets home, then have him call me. He did not get home. I was calling Al every 2 hours. Did David get home? Have you heard from him? Did he call? And about 6:30 that night, I called Al and I said, well, I'm going to call you tomorrow at work. 6:30, I'll call for David. If he's not there, I'll ask for you. So that Monday morning, I called Coca-Cola, and he had not shown up yet. And that's when I knew something was wrong.
The reunion with Johnny would never happen, and events were about to take a turn for the worse.
He spoke to somebody, he's going to get a pack of cigarettes, he'll be back, that's it. Then David doesn't come back.
So I called the police department right away, the Pembroke Pines Police, and they said I could come in at 4 o'clock. So Al and I went to the police station at 4 and reported him missing.
I get the report, I start contacting everybody. I spoke to family members, I spoke to friends, I spoke to his employer. This was very unusual behavior for David to go missing, and they felt something had happened to David. I went to the apartment, I saw he had a beautiful apartment. There was nothing suspicious in the apartment. I spoke to Al Brockland, who was his roommate. The only thing that Al was able to tell me was that David had gotten a phone call. He didn't say from whom, and David had taken a shower, borrowed a few dollars from him to go buy a pack of cigarettes. Al did not question him any further because he just thought, well, he spoke to somebody, he's going to get a pack of cigarettes, he'll be back, that's it. Then David doesn't come back. Unfortunately, back then, you didn't have to have your ID. You could just get on a plane and take off. There was nothing to indicate that he would want to leave, but yet, on the other hand, we had no evidence of anything that could help us resolve this case. We had no car, we had no body, there was 0 leads as to what had happened to him.
They said they had no leads. Number one, he was over 21. He's a male. They can come and go whenever they want. The only thing they said I could do is write the Social Security and the IRS that if, when he files taxes, they could send the letters to him, but otherwise nobody gets involved if they're over 21. I found a letter that he had written a few days before, and it was to a friend that he had met up in Connecticut when he went up there for a wedding.
In the letter that David wrote to his friend, asking for her advice on whether or not he should consider getting back with Barbara, he did mention having purchased furniture and whether or not he was going to set the apartment up, not only for John to come and visit, but for John to come and live permanently because Barbara may be coming back to live with him. It was a clear indication that perhaps he was really intending that Barbara might be coming back to him.
David's family didn't believe he would just walk out with the prospect of being reunited with his wife and child. They continued to search frantically for him.
Judy was very, very, very involved with this case. We did everything that we could do, and Judy would go beyond.
Every day I was calling them, and I would tell them and ask them, did they try this yet? Did they call the used car places? Did they check to see who was arrested the night before? Just everything I could think of. I called all the hospitals. I called all of his friends and let them know that he was missing in case they heard from him.
It makes your heart bleed when you talk to her and you listen to her and, she knows something's happened to her son and you can't help her.
She reached out to the Montel Williams show. She reached out to Oprah Winfrey. She reached out to the truck drivers. She wanted David's photograph to be put on the side of trucks of the truck drivers that would drive across state, any type of information that she could get, psychics, whatever.
I was constantly, of course, thinking about David. And anytime I saw a car that might look like his, I'd turn around and try to find it. If I saw someone that was tall, skinny, and blonde, I'd turn around and try to find him.
His brother Mark wouldn't give up the search either.
Mark dove into different canals. Mark even saw a psychic on his own and everything to find him because they were very close.
Then, 88 days later, out of the blue, David's black 1979 Toyota Celica car turned up at Fort Lauderdale Airport.
I proceeded to the parking lot where the car was, and that's when Broward Sheriff's Office came out to process the car for us so that we could see if we could locate any evidence in the car.
His glasses, along with cigarettes, a hairbrush, some beer bottles, and bullets, were pulled out of his car. The gun he always carried was gone. The strange thing was, all of these items, as well as David's car, were wiped clean.
No fingerprints, there was no blood, there was no hair, there was absolutely nothing.
The assumption they made was that he just left it there and took off for someplace. That possibly he was stressed over the Barbara and Johnny coming back.
It was just the most frustrating case that I had in my whole career because I wasn't able to bring peace to this family.
Oh, God. When he got that first communion.
Even though Judy never stopped searching for her son, with no body and no evidence, the case gradually went cold. There were no new leads in the case for 15 years until a cold case review was set up, and Donna Velasquez started working on it in 2003.
I was kind of taken aback because it's a box full of papers. That's all I had. It's not like I had a crime scene to visit. I didn't have any smoking gun. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a body. All I knew was that at one point in time, there was a man named David Jackson who was 24 when he disappeared, but where is he now?
Donna began her investigation by interviewing David's family.
I get a call from my son, Mark, and he said, I've got some good news. And I said, what? And he said, the Pembroke Pines Police Department called and they're going to reopen the case. And he gave me the detective's name, which was Donna Velasquez. So I called her immediately. And during our conversation, we decided that I'd go down there in 2 more days and take everything that I had of David's. And just before we hung up, I said, and she said the same thing, that God opened this case because he has answers. We just didn't know them yet.
At that time, I'm a mom of 3 kids. And I look at her, and she doesn't know where her child is. I said, I want to do everything that I can. And then some. And I never stopped after that. This was the longest outstanding missing persons case that we had, which dated back to June of 1988. I try to think, how in the world am I ever going to jumpstart this investigation? Where do I begin? And I thought a good place to begin would be forensic artistry. And what would David look like today? Let's put a copy of the original missing persons poster. And Judy had told me about a tattoo that David had. And she had a picture of it and she showed me. So I had our forensic artist draw a bigger version of David's tattoo. And I put the missing persons original flyer on one side, some current artistry with the tattoo, and like a description of David, how tall he was when he was last seen. And I took the whole thing and I put it above my desk. It just so happens that we have a Police Explorer post, and a Police Explorer is young teens that will come into the police department who shadow police officers in hopes of one day having a police career.
These were like junior police officers that we would consider from ages, I think, 14 to 21. And we wanted to make sure that these kids learned about the police department, learning about our specialized units, and they also took part in volunteering and being a part of our special events.
John Wolfe was one such intern.
He was a very shy individual, but he was very unique with his personality, quiet, laid back. I thought that I'd ask the question to them. I know you guys know this community and you know the people that live in this community. Look at these pictures that Donna had displayed and tell me, who are they? Tell me what's going on with these individuals. And John basically had that look on his face that something was a big connection with this one poster. And he said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "That individual right there is my dad." Lo and behold, this missing person is the father of one of our explorers in our class and has been a part of our group for a period of time. Never, ever connecting and never having any idea. Just shocking.
John's intervention was the first movement in the case in 15 years.
And that was my first break, because I'm looking for a John Jackson. He wasn't John Jackson anymore. He was John Wolfe. I said, "Clarence," I said, "ask him when he can come in and sit down and talk to me." So he says, hey, John, he says, can you come and sit down and talk to Detective Velasquez? He says, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow.
Were detectives and family members finally going to get some answers to the mystery of the disappearance of David Jackson?
Please state your name and date of birth for the record.
John Henry Wolf.
How do you know David Churchill Jackson?
He's my father.
Okay, and your mother's name is?
Barbara Wolf.
During this interview, John Wolfe gave the investigators the biggest lead the case had had since it began.
When I called her up at Happy's anything that you pulled the case and everything, she got very defensive and very touchy. I believe personally that she told her back information.
Detective, he says, I think my mom is withholding information. I think she knows what happened. I said, well, tell me what happened. He says, I went home, he says, and I was so excited that Detective Velasquez is reopening my dad's case. I want to know what happened to him. He says, and I'm telling my mom this. And she says to me, they need to leave it alone. The case was closed a long time ago. What are you trying to do, have me arrested?
You know, so what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to call the detective and I'm going to see what I can tell her and see what they have to tell me. Maybe we can find something new. She's like, you don't need to find anything new. I told you everything. She's like, okay, just don't bring me into it.
So she doesn't want to be involved in it. She's kind of washed her hands of it?
Basically, yeah. There must be something she's not telling me.
He was very skeptical of what she was saying. And he was even more eager for us to push forward and try to find out what happened to his dad.
I saw Johnny the last time in 1991, and this was 2003. He wanted to meet us that day. So that same day, John, Mark, and I went to lunch, and the whole time John held my hand, and Mark gave Johnny David's class ring. John had told us that his mother had everyone in the neighborhood always watch out if a strange car would pull up, that his mother was always afraid that someone would come and take him, that myself or David would come and steal him away from her. She told Johnny that David had burned his head with cigarettes and that David would shove food down his throat, and that's why he didn't like to eat a lot of things. She also said that he was abused by David and myself. And of course, she never called the police, and that was because nothing ever happened.
Detective Velasquez began to discover more about the relationship between David and Barbara and her family.
I take the investigation down the road now that I need to start investigating Barbara, and I need to start investigating Barbara's husband at the time of David's disappearance, who was Michael Wolfe. 5 months after David disappears, Michael Wolfe is petitioning for the adoption of John Jackson and goes to an attorney's office and starts filing the paperwork, which I thought was strange, that David goes missing and it's only not even an extended period of time, a very short period of time, 5 months, before a stepfather decides that he's now going to adopt this child. So I'm thinking to myself, well, really the only reason or motive that you would have to adopt this child is because you know in your heart and your mind, David's never coming back to contest anything, because he would have never given up his child. You know already there's no chance that David's going to come fight for custody because you've done something to him.
Donna Velasquez was now convinced that she wasn't dealing with a missing persons case. She was investigating a murder.
So as I start the investigation, and it's my belief that David's no longer alive, I look at Florida and I look at the water table that we have. And if anybody were to have ever buried him along the way, I would have expected remains to have come up to the ground, been discovered. So I start Googling unidentified remains, unsolved homicides, and it led me into a website called the Florida Unidentified Decedents Database. The medical examiners throughout the state of Florida would take their unidentifieds and load them into a program to which we would be able to access. So it prompts me through the program. It asks me gender, it asks me height, it asks me date of last known to have been alive. So I put in my criteria and it pops out, gosh, it must have popped out 50 to 100 matches. It seemed like the printer just kept going and going and going. I dwindle it down to 3, and I come across the one. The remains are found in 1989, a year later, one city south in the city of Miramar from Pembroke Pines. And it said that the person was male and he was probably over 6'2". Okay, maybe.
But it would turn out to be more than a maybe.
In 1989, there was some land that was being excavated for the building of a shopping mall, and some of the workers found what appeared to be human remains.
They called out our forensic pathologist at the time, was Dr. Bell, and they went to the scene and did determine that they were human remains. They were completely skeletal at that time. He requested that the police department solicit the services of some police cadets in order to further expand the search around the area where the bones were found. And eventually 29 bones were located in the site. And then the bones were taken back to the laboratory for further examination at the medical examiner's office. The anthropologist came in to assist Dr. Bell so that they could attempt to develop a biological profile on the individual to try and narrow down height, possible ethnicity, sex of the individual, and anything else that could assist them in trying to determine possibly who this person was.
But no identification was ever made, and the bones stayed in storage until Detective Velasquez came upon them.
A sample of the bones were taken in order to be sent off to a DNA lab to obtain mitochondrial DNA for comparison with a family member of the missing person that Detective Velasquez was investigating.
Mitochondrial DNA is from mother to child. So this is going to require that I reach out to Judy. I want to reach out to Judy, but I don't want to give Judy any false hope. I say to her, listen, I just want you to come in and I want you to give a DNA sample, because if in the future we find anything that may lead us to any remains, then I'll have it on file and I won't have to ask you to come back down. She's like, okay, well, I'll see you on Friday. I send the bone and I send Judy's blood sample to Mitotyping Technologies.
2 weeks later, Donna called to get the results.
She says, well, I sure hope you're sitting down. She says, because you got a 100% match. I couldn't believe it. I was ecstatic. And I said, a 100% match? She goes, yes. She says, because Judy has atypical characteristics throughout her DNA, and David shares those characteristics. So then you know that I have to tell Judy.
So Donna called Judy and asked her down to the station.
She said the remains are 100% David. And she gave me a beautiful little angel, which I have on my dresser, and said she was sorry, and we all just cried.
Finally, the remains of David Jackson could be laid to rest. But this was no longer a missing persons case. Donna Velasquez now knew she was dealing with a murder.
I knew that David was no longer missing. I knew that we had to move forward in a homicide investigation.
First up to be interviewed are David's ex-wife Barbara Britton and her new husband at the time of David's death, Michael Wolfe.
My sergeant and my partner, Daryl Curtis, are out in Kettering, Ohio, interviewing Michael Wolfe in an interview room while I am sitting in the home of Barbara Britton interviewing her. She starts hyperventilating and she starts crying and she falls down to the ground and she crawls into a bedroom and then she comes back out. I mean, this is very bizarre behavior. She comes back to the table and she says, how many bones do you have? What do you mean, how many bones do I have? Because who would ask that question? Why would you need to know how many bones do I have? I'm telling you that I've positively identified these remains as being David Jackson, your ex-husband and the father of your child. I feel like I'm sitting with someone who actually participated in the crime.
At the same time, Michael Wolff was being interviewed in Ohio.
Let me ask you real quick. Did you kill David Jackson? Oh, no. Do you know who killed David Jackson? I don't even know that he's dead. Well, we covered his body. Oh.
Michael Wolff would not say anything. When the detectives that were questioning him called Donna, she put the pressure on.
Please go back in and don't give up. Keep on with your questioning, because I know he was involved. Absolutely, in my gut, I know he's involved. It comes out that Michael Wolff starts saying, well, if it were to have happened, it happened like this. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper.
Michael Wolff began to explain why David had been murdered.
Barbara kept telling her father that David was abusing John. So her father, being a military man himself, was very angry with the fact that his grandchild was being abused. And Harry said to Michael Wolff, I am never going to rest until David is face up in a pine box in Fred Hunter Funeral Home.
Harry and I had discussed this. David's demise. I told him the type of weapon to use.
What type of weapon was that?
I was in a .22 caliber. I told him it had to be headshot.
Shoot him in the head. When did you have this discussion with Harry?
Oh my God, it was probably 3 or 4 months before the disappearance.
Harry Britton, Barbara's father, was no longer alive to be questioned, and Michael Wolff insisted that he had nothing to do with the disappearance, apart from that conversation with Harry.
It wasn't me. Between you and I always thought her dad had something to do with it. No, I don't know. He was a hothead. He was a hothead, and Johnny could do no wrong. And if he thought Johnny was being mistreated in any way, I wouldn't put it past him, but it wasn't me.
Donna began to look at all aspects of Michael's life to see if there was anything that could connect him directly to the murder of David.
He was a military police officer in the Air Force, and he had served time overseas. So that meant to me that he would have knowledge, training, and experience with firearms. So I decided I'm going to reach out and see if he had ever held any federal firearms licenses after he got out of the military. I get in touch with ATF, and they found dissemination logs on him holding 2 different federal firearms licenses, to which he had only bought, sold, or traded and done 5 different transactions. So in going through each of the applications, I come across a Nancy Graham. And Nancy Graham's address on her application matched the federal firearms license of Michael Wolff. Where does she fit into this puzzle? How does she fit into this puzzle? Because she certainly does. So I run a background check on her, and I find her in Alabama. And I place a call to her one morning. And I say to her, were you a girlfriend of Michael Wolff? And you all lived at this address? And she said, yes. And we later got married. We were husband and wife. And she says, but we've since divorced. I said, do you know who David Jackson is? She said, yes, I do. I said, well, what do you know? She says, how much evidence do you have on Michael Wolff? This is who's involved. This is where they did it. This is how they did it. This is where they buried the bodies. And I said, stop. I've got to get on a plane, and I've got to come to you.
Donna Velasquez got on a flight to Alabama. The net was beginning to close. But would she finally get the answers David's family had been searching for all along?
How did you gain this knowledge?
He told me. He was drinking real bad. Every night he would almost down a whole bottle of scotch.
She says, I think through the years, as he became older, it bothered him more and more. She said, so he would speak more and more about it.
During interview, Nancy was clear what Michael had told her.
Barbara contacted David She let him believe that maybe there was a chance of them getting back together. And he was supposed to meet her at a Motel 6.
He had told Nancy that it was Barbara that made the phone call to lure David to the hotel room. They used Barbara as the drawing card because Barbara had led David to believe that she wanted to get back together with him. And that's how they were going to get David to the Motel 6 and put their plan into motion.
David showed up with a six-pack in hand. He knocked on the door, and Michael Wolff was in the bathroom with a gun.
And when David arrived, it was supposed to be that Barbara was going to stun him with a stun gun and knock him out, but the stun gun didn't work. And Michael had to come out of the bathroom, and he raises the gun, and it's wrapped in a towel, and he shoots one time, and it comes over David's left ear, just above his left ear. But it doesn't kill him, it dazes him. And Barbara grabs him by the arm and sits him down in a chair. Well, Harry Britton was outside of the hotel room, heard the shot go off. He comes racing in and sees David still breathing. And he says to Michael Wolff, "You need to shoot him again," he says, "and shoot him in the heart." He goes, "I'm not gonna shoot him in the heart." He goes, "That's crazy." So what does he do? He shoots him in the head again, and the second shot kills him.
They cleaned up the room as best they could. They took all the cleaning products. They took David's car, and they followed Barbara to the airport where she left it. They told Barbara to go home. He and Harry took the body, went out to the place where ultimately his bones were found, and buried them.
Then they go back to Harry Britton's house in Pembroke Pines, Florida. The three of them did, and proceed to move forward with their lives.
I don't like the word closure. It was knowing the facts. Closure is when he walks through the door and he says, "Hi, Mom," and you can feel him and touch him. So I knew the facts now.
After Nancy Graham came forward, Donna and I discussed it, and we really believe that now with this piece of direct evidence that we had somebody who would say that Michael Wolff actually participated, that along with the circumstantial evidence of everything going on, that we could go to a grand jury seeking to get an indictment. We execute an arrest warrant. I handed it to her and I said, "Go get him." And she went up to Ohio and put him in cuffs.
It was big news in Kettering, Ohio, when Michael Wolff was arrested for the cold case homicide of David Jackson, so there was a lot of news coverage on it. And it just so happened that Carol Larson's daughter lived in Ohio, and Carol Larson was also one of Michael Wolff's wives. And she told almost a parallel story, the exact same story that Nancy Graham did, and the two of them were willing to go to court and testify.
Now you have two people who don't know each other, who've never met each other, who are saying the exact same thing, which kind of inherently proves the reliability of what they're saying.
We worked very diligently together and very dogged together to get this to go to trial. Michael Wolff is saying that he's not involved in it. He had absolutely no knowledge of it. He still has no knowledge of it. He doesn't know what happened. The only thing that he did was he told Harry that if he were going to do it, that this is how you should probably do it. And he remained steadfast with that scenario through the trial.
What really solidified the conviction was the circumstances surrounding David's having gone missing. It was that letter saying that Barbara really wants to get together. It was that the fact that David had begun to win child custody, which had been such a sore subject with everybody, including Barbara and her father and her mother, leading up to David's disappearance.
Nancy Graham's account, her first account information that we got from her was enough to gain probable cause. It just added to our case in the fact that Carol Larson came forward and told the exact same story. And when the both of them showed up in court and to testify at the trial, I do believe that's exactly what sealed his fate.
After he was convicted, I got a phone call from his attorneys who said he wants to tell you what happened. And we had a meeting. He was brought to my office and he came in and he said, I want to tell you everything that happened.
He gave a full account of everything, a full admission as to what he had done and how Barbara was involved and how Harry was involved.
Michael Wolff actually said that about a few months later, when it was publicized in the newspaper that they were going to build this shopping mall, that he called Michael and said, we need to do something. And Michael actually flew back to town and went out and redug up the bones and tried to move them someplace where they wouldn't be found.
Michael recalls crawling out over sand, trying to hide from the security guard because there was security around with a flashlight. And he says before he knew it, he was actually in the grave and it stunk so bad he said he couldn't stand it. And he reached in and he pulled up the spine and it brought up the spinal column along with a lot of the pelvic girdle and some of the long bones of the leg, but he could not find the skull.
Detectives knew that Wolff didn't succeed in retrieving all of the bones that night. But they also had a theory on what had happened to David's skull before Wolff ever got anywhere near the grave.
Prior to that, there was no such thing as DNA. The only way that you could effectively identify anyone would have been through a dental chart and or fingerprints. And because of Harry's experience in the military, he would have known that. So Harry went back and dug David's head up, the skull. And we believe that Harry placed the skull in a trash bag and put it out for the garbage bin, and it's at the Broward County landfill.
Barbara Britton called her mother, Connie Britton, every day, most of the time, more than once a day. In the days surrounding this particular David's disappearance, those calls stopped. So we really believe that had she been in Arizona at her house, she would have been calling her mother, and she wasn't. One of the other very strong circumstantial pieces of evidence that Barbara may have been involved in this, it was very obvious that she was trying to get David to meet her someplace secretly. And there were a number of phone calls where she was communicating with David, and certainly you would expect if she's bringing her child there that they would communicate, but not to this degree.
Had she not made that phone call, the catalyst, the driving force to lure David to the hotel room, he would have never gone there because he would have never gone to meet Michael Wolff and he would have never gone to meet Harry Britton. What would have been the purpose of that? He knew ill will would have been visited upon him. He was going to meet her when she called under the pretenses of that she was going to get back together with him. They offered her a plea deal of accessory after the fact, to where she would have to come into the courtroom and admit her guilt and that she would have to be punished accordingly.
This never would have happened except for Barbara Britton and especially her father.
It was a tragedy that did not need to happen. In that David never abused John. The only thing David was guilty of was wanting to be a part of his son's life. But Barbara was never going to allow that. And so she came up with a plot and a plan to get rid of him and started feeding it to her father. All because you don't want to share custody with your son's dad. How evil can you be? That told me right then and there that evil does walk the face of the earth. I'm grateful that I was the one that was chosen for whatever reason to bring it to a resolution, a successful resolution. This is a case that took up 10 years of my life from start to finish. I lost a marriage. But if you asked me if I would do it all over again so that she would know, I would. I would do it all over again for her.
I talked to him all the time. I didn't think it would ever get solved. But he was always there with me.